All right, well, thank you for all those that are joining us or still coming into the room now. And my name is Ben Thiessen. I am a co-director for the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. And our special webinar tonight is with Colin Neufeldt, and it is entitled Those Who Remained, Dekulakization and the Mennonite Countryside. And before we begin, I just wish to acknowledge that this is a virtual event, but I'm coming to you virtually here from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, the ancestral and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Shinnecock, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and the heartland of the Métis First Nation. And as those of us that are historians writing about Mennonites or members of the public interested in Mennonite history, it of course behooves us to think about Indigenous Mennonite relations in the context of settler colonialism and missionary relationships and outreach relationships as well. And so just as a brief advertisement before we get underway here, I want to direct your attention to a virtual and in-person conference which is being held at Conrad Grebel University College in Kitchener-Waterloo, which a few folks in the room are coming in from at least nearby from, which is the Indigenous Mennonite Encounters Conference, set to take place May 12th to May 15th on the campus there at Conrad Grebel, but also live streamed. And so you can look for opportunities to attend virtually or take part in person if you're in that area at the time. And so our talk tonight is by Dr. Colin Neufeldt. And Colin is a professor of history at Concordia University of Edmonton. His research focus is primarily on the history of Mennonites in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And I've got two recent publications he appeared in here, which my blur may not make very visible, but one recently, the excellent edited collection, European Mennonites and the Holocaust. Colin has an essay in there. And the other, Minority Report, Mennonite Identities in Imperial Russia and Soviet Ukraine Reconsidered, 1789 to 1945. Colin is also a leader practicing lawyer and lives in Edmonton. And yeah, I just want to say I'm particularly excited for this talk, Those Who Remained, tonight, partly not because this is my research area of specialty, but this is a bit more of my family area of specialty in that, and I was just going back to the account of my Oma Agnes Thiessen, born in 1924 and currently living in Abbotsford, who writes that she was the second oldest of 7 children, born in 1924. And in 1927, her parents, she says, were desperate to immigrate to Canada, but could not get permission. And they then moved to the nearby village of Bloemengart instead. And she was not able to leave the region until the post-World War II era. So I'm excited to hear what Colin has to teach us tonight. We'll leave about 40 minutes for his talk, and then we'll open it up for questions. So please feel free to populate the Q&A button with any questions that come to mind as Colin is speaking. And I'll turn it over now to Colin. I'll just briefly post in the address for the Conrad Grebel conference I mentioned. And of course, you can find the previous videos in this webinar on our CTMS website, which I'll also put in. So Colin, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, good evening, and thank you for that introduction and for inviting me to present this evening. I'm in the process of recovering from a bout of COVID, so I have a bit of a cough and a stuffy nose, but hopefully that won't be too interruptive during the meeting. I've got lots of water and Kleenexes close by, so hopefully I'll be able to get through it without too many coughs and sniffles. So before, in order to get started, I want to share my PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my screen here. Just give me a second. Now, can you see that?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, good. Thank you. So first of all, I want to express my sorrow and sympathy for the people of Ukraine as they deal with a horrible invasion of their homeland and the war crimes committed against them. I also want to express my admiration and hope for the Ukrainian people as they defend their right to exist and to live in their country without tyranny or fear. Those who remained, dekulakization and collectivization in Mennonite communities of Ukraine. So to get started, I think it's very important to have some background information to provide a bit of a context. Mennonites first established colonies in Ukraine in the 1780s during the reign of Catherine the Great. The first colony was Kortitsa with 19 villages near Zaporizhia. Second colony was Molotchna or Molochansk with 60 villages northeast of Melitopol. By 1914, there were 2 mother colonies, Khortytsa and Molotchna, and over 30 daughter colonies in Ukraine. The Mennonite population in Ukraine was around 75,000 in 1914 and over 56,000 in 1925. So here's a map showing the major, largest Mennonite communities in southern Ukraine in the 1920s. Of course, this is not all of them, but it gives you an idea of some of the larger colonies. Below the yellow arrow is the Khortytsa colony, which was one of the mother colonies. And also above the green arrow is the colony of Molotchna or Molochansk. And you should know that, as time progresses, especially right up until World War I, Mennonites are finding it increasingly difficult to live in these colonies. And that's because the cost of land and the shortage of land makes it increasingly difficult, especially for poorer Mennonites, to remain in the colonies. And over time, more and more Mennonites are migrating out of the colonies, and some of whom are moving into the larger cities to find work. They still have connections with the colonies, but the reality is that they can't stay in the colonies because of the shortage of land and because of the cost of land. Also surrounding the Mennonite colonies were many other minority groups. And so you have Germans, which are indicated by the blue circle, the blue dots, and that includes, of course, Lutheran Germans, Catholic Germans, also Baptists. You also have Jewish groups, Jewish colonies surrounding Mennonite colonies. You have the Russian ones, which are indicated by the kind of the orange color. There are also Bulgarian, which are indicated by the flesh tone color dots, and also Greek colonies. And so Mennonites are not the only group. There are many other groups, minority groups besides Ukrainians. And Mennonites are interacting with Ukrainians, but they're also interacting with these other minority groups as time progresses. And over time, more and more, especially the poorer Mennonites, they're moving into these other areas of Ukraine just because they just don't have enough land or access to land in the colonies. And so there's, in some cases, Mennonites interacting with some of these other groups, and in some cases marrying into these other ethnic groups aside from just the Ukrainians. So how did Soviet leaders view the Mennonites? In the early 1920s, Mennonites in Ukraine tried to define themselves as Dutch, but Soviet leaders viewed them as an ethnic German-speaking ethno-religious sect. Many Soviet leaders were also suspicious of the Mennonites because of their pre-revolutionary wealth and large land holdings, their support for the German army during World War I and the White Army during the Russian Civil War that happened between 1918 and 1921, and also the Mennonites' organization of Selbstschutz, or self-defense corps units, to defend their communities against anarchists and the Red Army during the Civil War. So as a result, the Soviet government often labeled Mennonites as kulaks, counter-revolutionaries, sectarians, religious fanatics, and enemies of the Soviet state. Not surprisingly, many Mennonites, especially those who were religious or wealthy, viewed the Bolsheviks with suspicion, and they had trouble accepting the new atheistic Bolshevik government. Over time, some Mennonites came to accept the new Bolshevik regime, but others did not. And as pacifists, many Mennonites resisted the Soviet regime by emigrating from the country. By 1929, almost 20,000 Mennonites, Soviet Mennonites, immigrated from the USSR, most of whom going to Canada and South America. But there were also many Mennonites in Ukraine who actively supported the Bolsheviks, who participated in the organization and operation of collective farms, and who worked in Soviet institutions, including village and district Soviets and committees of the village poor. A small percentage of Mennonites also became members of the Communist Party and the Komsomol. So here you have a complicated map of the Khortytsa colony in 1922. This is shortly after the Civil War and almost at the end of the famine in Ukraine in the early 1920s. And so you'll see these red stars. That indicates where there were a number of Red Army families. Those were families of Mennonites who served in the Red Army during the Civil War. And you can see there in almost every Mennonite village, there were a number of Red Army families that were operating there, and the Soviet government was providing them typically with assistance like social security and welfare for their service to the Red Army during the Civil War. You can see that there's a kind of an orange, I guess, trapezoid or funny looking square right beside the village of Chortitza. There was a Communist Party cell in Chortitza already in 1922, and there are a number of Mennonites who are members of the Communist Party cell already at that early stage. The green, I guess, pentagon represent village Soviet committees and also executive members that are pro-Soviet. And you can see in almost every village, there are these village Soviets that are already established in 1922. And there are Mennonites working in those pro-Soviet village executive committees. The blue kind of star represents committees of the poor peasants. And this was a pro-Soviet organization that represented the interests of the poorest members of Soviet society. And in all of these Mennonite villages in Chortitza, for example, there were committees of the poor peasants that included the names of Mennonites. And also you have already in 1922, a number of collective farms. Now, some of these collective farms are very small in size, anywhere from 5 to 10 households. But there were at least 64 of these so-called collectives already in Chortitza alone in 1922. And it's understandable why Mennonites would join these collective farms. After years of war and civil war, and after years of famine, many Mennonites just could not simply farm on their own. And so often the poorest members of the village often join these collective farms as a way of trying to, put together their land holdings and their machinery, whatever machinery they had, to try to farm together. Now, a lot of these collective farms would not last until past the mid-1920s, but it's already clear that in the early 1920s, there were a number of Mennonites that were involved in various Soviet institutions, including like the Communist Party, Village Soviet Executive, and also collectives and committees of the poor peasants. And so this is just in the Chortitza colony. I'm not looking at Molochna, which has its own experiences, also other Mennonite colonies, but it's the same story throughout many of these Mennonite communities where you have large numbers of Mennonites, especially the poor, participating in various Soviet organizations. So this is a diagram showing the basic levels of the Soviet government. And this is a very rudimentary diagram, but it kind of gives you kind of the different levels of Soviet government, not only in the countryside, but all the way up to the governance in Moscow. I want to start at the bottom at the village Soviet level beside the orange arrow. So already in the 1920s, you have a large number of Mennonites participating in the village Soviets. They are members, helping the Soviet government to administer their communities. And so most of them are the poorest members of the Mennonite community, but there are definitely large numbers. And you can see that in the village Soviet records, the minutes of the meetings, you can see all these Mennonite names participating in the village Soviet. There are also Mennonites who are participating in the district Soviet level. And so this district Soviet manages a larger area, often a number of communities, sometimes as many as 20 or 40 or 60 communities. And there are Mennonites definitely participating in that, especially where there are large numbers of Mennonite communities. So in Molochansk, for example, Molochna, Chortitza, there are large numbers of Mennonites who are participating at that level. There are a fewer number of Mennonites participating at the regional Soviet level, which is the blue arrow. There are not many names, but there are definitely some Mennonites who move up into that higher echelon. To what extent Mennonites are participating in the Ukrainian Congress of Soviets in Kharkiv or in the Congress of Soviets and the Politburo and the higher levels in Moscow, I can't say for certain. I haven't spent a lot of time looking through those records. And so I haven't found names of Mennonites. That doesn't mean that they weren't working in those upper levels, but I haven't been able to determine that to be the case. And so certainly at the lower levels, you do see large numbers of Mennonites participating at the regional level, the district level, and the village Soviet level. So here, for example, is a list of Mennonites who worked in the Chortitza District Executive Council in 1929-1930. So you have people like Heinrich G. Rempel, a very influential person working at that time, I.A. Knelson, Abram J. Taves, Aganeta Sawatsky, a woman, Kozlovsky, David Brown, Ekaterina H. Siemens, Ivana Penner, two other women, Johann P. Quiring, Johann D. Rempel, Heinrich A. Dick, Vera F. Schultz, another woman, Johann J. Willems, Heppner, R. Zacharias, and Friesen. And the ones that are highlighted in bold are really those Mennonites that are at the upper executive council. They're the ones that are making the most important decisions. These other names are people that often attend committee meetings, but they're not the most influential people. And so the ones like Heinrich G. Rempel, Abram Taves, Johann P. Quiring, Heinrich Dick, Johann J. Willems, you often see their names on many of the important district Soviet records, minutes of meetings in the Khortytsa area. You also have Mennonites participating in the Khortytsa Communist Party Committee already in 1928. So here you see the names of Heinrich Freyes, Gerhard Willems, Heinrich G. Rempel, Johann P. Quiring, Jacob J. Friesen, Johann J. Wiebe, Gerhard G. Willems, Jacob Peters, E. Schmidt, Vera F. Schultz, Katrina P. Martins, Corny J. Harms, M. Block, Abram J. Enns, Johann Willems, Elena F. Braun, David J. Kozlovsky, Peter Kasdorf, Aganeta K. Sawatsky, A.I. Velke, and Conrad Mattis. Now, these are members of the Communist Party committee in Khortytsa in 1928 to 1930. Not all of them are full-fledged, full members. A lot of them are candidates. They are people that have kind of gone through the first process of becoming members. And so they're, you become a candidate and you serve as a candidate for a number of years. You go through the vetting process and eventually become full-fledged members. And so some of these people are candidates, some of them are full-fledged members. The most important members at this time are Heinrich G. Rempel, Johann P. Quiring, and Johann J. Willems, and they were also working, as I mentioned before, in the District Soviet. And this, of course, is just happening in Khortytsa. The same thing is happening in other Mennonite communities, Molochansk and other daughter colonies as well. So why did Mennonites work for the Soviet government? Well, some of them really wanted to help their community. They wanted to see their communities improve. And so they were naturally interested in politics and wanted to work to help improve their community. Of course, political influence and control is another reason why they joined. These are Mennonites. They didn't always want to let the Ukrainians or Russians or other minority groups take control of their communities. And so it's better, they thought, that Mennonites were working in these positions than allowing other groups, including Ukrainians or Russians or Jews, taking control of all those positions. Another important reason is social mobility. A lot of Mennonites, especially poorer Mennonites, want to move up in society. They want to get a better job, a job that pays more, has more opportunities, especially educational opportunities. And so if you're part of the Soviet government system, you're going to have more opportunities for your children, for example, to attend university. And so that's one reason why Mennonites participate in this. Fear and intimidation is another reason. A lot of people thought if I work for the state, it's more likely that I will avoid being attacked or targeted by the state later on. And so you join the state to avoid, the possible attacks that may come later on from the state. So fear and intimidation, of course, is another factor. You want to protect your family from dekulakization. And we're going to talk about dekulakization in a few minutes, but that's another reason. You also realize that immigration to the West is less likely. It's not possible, especially after 1929, to emigrate to the West. So if you can't emigrate, if you can't leave, you're going to join the state in some cases in order to protect yourself. And of course, Bolshevik idealism is another reason. Many Mennonites actually believed in communism. They believed in the communist ideology. And so they joined, especially the Communist Party, because of that idealism. And already by 1934, you have some Mennonites who are working for the Soviet secret police. So in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Stalin has implemented a number of very repressive policies in the USSR. One of these policies is collectivization, which aimed to integrate Mennonite landholdings and labor into collective farms and state farms. This often meant forcing peasants onto collective and state farms. And by February of 1930, for example, over 52% of Soviet peasants, at least 10 million households, were already collectivized. And by 1931, this had increased to over 62%. We're going to talk about collectivization a little bit later on. But first of all, I think it's important that we talk about dekulakization. Dekulakization was another important policy introduced by Stalin, and it was directed against millions of so-called kulaks and their families. And it's important to remember that dekulakization and collectivization happened at the same time. So who were these kulaks? Well, typically they were more prosperous peasants who might have owned a little bit more land, maybe 10 to 25 hectares, when compared to poorer peasants, which typically owned anywhere from 1 to 3 to 5 hectares. Kulaks often owned a little bit more livestock than poor peasants, so they might have 2 or 3 horses instead of 1, as was common for poor peasant families, or they might have 2 cows instead of 1. They might also have a motor or mechanized farm equipment, machinery, and sometimes they hired poor peasants to help them with farm work, especially in the spring and in the fall harvest. And so they were considered to be capitalists because they were hiring these poor peasants to help them with the farm work. So the Soviet government considered kulaks to be capitalists, counter-revolutionaries, and agitators who hindered socialist construction. And according to the Soviet state, 3 to 5% of the population were kulaks. In late 1929, Stalin ordered that kulaks have to be liquidated as a class. In January of 1930, the Politburo created 3 categories of kulaks. So the most dangerous was known as the counter-revolutionary kulak active, or category 1. And they included church leaders, moneylenders, former landlords and estate owners, the wealthiest peasants, fugitive kulaks, criminals, insurgents, bandits, and former members of the White Guard. They were to be exiled or executed. Second category of kulaks were the kulak active, often referred to as category 2 kulaks. They were to be exiled or imprisoned. And the third category was known as just simply as kulak. They were to be resettled on poor land in home districts where they lived. So they weren't always to be exiled directly out of Ukraine, but they were often moved to kind of scruff land or to bushland near their villages where farming would be very difficult. And they were to be ostracized from the rest of the community. So the government provided kulak quotas for specific regions and communities, and it was up to local officials to meet these quotas. In Mennonite communities, local officials included Mennonites, Ukrainians, Russians, Germans, Jews, and other minorities. Mennonite officials called on village leaders to identify and denounce Mennonite kulaks and religious leaders of their communities. They imposed heavy taxes and grain quotas on Mennonite farmers. They assisted in the confiscation and sale of Mennonite property. They signed the orders that authorized the arrest of Mennonites and participated in the deportation, exile of fellow Mennonites. So Mennonite officials were involved in that process. So here you see an order dated January of 1930, and the order was signed by Quiring, Willems, and Dick, and it orders village Soviets in Khortytsa to identify kulak families and to prepare lists of kulaks. This order here is in German. A lot of the orders are in Russian, but every once in a while you'll see an order in German, especially if they wanted that order to be circulated to Mennonite villages so that everybody could read it. And so in this case here, it's Quiring, Willems, and Dick, who are ordering local village Soviets in Khortytsa to identify kulak households. This here is the first page of the Ostervik in Khortytsa Village Soviet Protocol. It's dated February of 1930. And it's really kind of the minutes of a meeting of the villagers of the village of Ostervik who come together one evening and identify who are the kulak families within their community. It's their job to identify these kulaks. And so in this case here, Rempel served as the village Soviet chairman. He's the one that's in charge of the meeting. Vogt is the secretary. And these minutes describe who is all there and how they come to this determination as to which Mennonite families are going to be considered to be kulaks. And so, in some cases, you find out brothers are identifying brothers as kulaks. Some cases, you have children identifying parents as kulaks. But the process is really up to them. They have to come up with these lists, these quotas of Kulak families, and then they have to submit it to the district Soviet for approval. This here is a dekulakization order for Jacob Abram Paykow. It's dated March of 1930. And so you can kind of see there are two main columns. On the left-hand side, it talks about Jacob Abram Paykow. And this, of course, is in Russian. It tells you how old he is. He's 57 years of age. It tells you how much taxes he paid, how much land he has. It also tells you how much land and how much cattle or how many horses he had prior to the revolution. And on the right-hand side, it's the order directing what's going to happen to this Jacob Abram Paykow as a Kulak family. And the order basically says that he's going to be resettled in Ukraine as part of this category 3 set of kulaks. And the order was signed by Johann Willems, who was the secretary of the Khortytsa District Soviet. And so you have these long lists of what's going to happen to these Mennonites. This is a list of kulaks from Ostrovik, Khortytsa. The list was prepared, finalized by Quiring and Willems in March of 1930. And you can see, number 1 looks like it's Andrei Rempel, and then there's a Winter, and the list goes on and on. In most cases, these kulaks, these Mennonite kulaks, are going to be resettled outside of their home villages. But in some cases, Quiring and Willems direct that these people have to be exiled to the north, to the far north, to Siberia. And in some cases, Quiring and Willems recommend execution of fellow Mennonites. And so you do see every once in a while an order that a particular Mennonite is considered to be a counter-revolutionary active Kulak and should be executed. So in carrying out their orders, Mennonite officials serve as agents of the state in terms of persecution. They legitimize state-sponsored violence. They were often very zealous in dekulakizing Mennonite communities. They had to prove that they were loyal to the Soviet state. They severely undermined the authority of traditional Mennonite religious, political, and social institutions. And they facilitate the collectivization of their villages under Soviet authority. And they also facilitate and integrate their Mennonite communities into the surrounding non-Mennonite communities. Most Mennonite kulaks were identified as category 3 kulaks at this time. Later on, it's going to change. And so category 3 kulaks, they are to be evicted from their homes in order to move into vacated peasant huts or into abandoned buildings set aside for them by village authorities. In Khortytsa, category 3 kulaks were eventually moved onto so-called zabornies, or special kulak settlements, located near their home villages in 1930, 1931. And here these category 3 kulaks were forced to build their own shelters and toil often on local government projects, often for a little pay. They lived a life of desperate poverty until they died or were exiled from the Ukraine in 1931-32. So here's an order. This is an order from Quiring, Willems, and Dick, instructing village Soviets to set aside land for these kulak settlements, for these zabornies, for category 3 kulaks. And so you can see this one is written in German. It tells you which communities are supposed to set aside, usually the worst land, the scruff land, the bush land, where these category 3 kulaks are going to be moved to. This here is a map that I created that shows the 4 main Zaborny or category 3 kulak settlements that were created in Khortytsa colony in 1930. So the blue one is Zaborny number 1, and it's located right beside the Dnieper River, right kind of on the banks of the Dnieper River. This is one of the largest of these category 3 kulak settlements. The red one is Zaborny number 2. It's located between the villages of Burvalde and Niederkhortytsa. Zaborny number 3 is between Ostrovik and Rosengard. And Zaborny number 4, the green one, is located between Neuendorf and Neuenburg. And you can see that kind of blue line with these kind of cross lines marked across it. That indicates railroads that were existing at the time when these Zabornies were established. And so you can see that a lot of these Zabornies, these special kulak settlements, were located very close to railways. Because when you want to move these category 3 kulaks, later on, you're going to move them up north. You want to have it close to railway so that you can load them up onto trains and move them out to the far north, which is Siberia. This is a map of this Zaborny #1, this Kulak settlement that was right beside the Dnieper River. And it actually shows you the plots and the families that were located on those plots. It had at least 92 Mennonites and 6 Ukrainians in late 1930. Most of these families would eventually either be exiled, or in some cases, they would just simply die from the very difficult living conditions that they were forced to endure. So the dekulakization procedure was different for category 1 and category 2 kulaks. The secret police often arrested the adult males in these 2 categories and held them in custody, often in local prisons. But because there were so many kulaks being arrested at the same time, they actually had to start using barns and cellars to store and to hold all of these kulaks. And they were often held there for weeks at a time until they were deported. And while in custody, many endured torture and starvation. Their families were forced to move into abandoned peasant huts or makeshift shelters until they were deported. Eventually, the secret police reunited these kulak men that were held in custody and their families at the local train stations, where they were loaded into livestock and freight cars, often 40 to 50 people per car. And so you have these long trains, often with 1,000 to 2,000 kulaks, now beginning their journey to hundreds of exile settlements scattered across the USSR, often in the far north, but also into Siberia, and also the Far East. So here you have a picture of kulaks waiting to be loaded onto a train bound for the north. And so it's at this point that they're often reunited with their families and they're shipped away to these exile settlements in these distant areas of the USSR. So these poor kulaks, they're locked in railway cars. The Mennonite exiles have no way of knowing what's going to happen to them or where they're going. The journey to the exile settlements, which often lasted 2 to 3 weeks, was often in bitterly cold conditions, and it was miserable and often deadly. The interior of the freight cars and the cattle cars was unlit and poorly ventilated. The temperature ranged from extremely hot to bone-chilling cold temperatures, depending on the season. And because of the cramped conditions, kulaks often had to sleep in shifts or standing up. The absence of sanitary facilities in rail cars exacerbated the situation. Passengers often had to use the food and water buckets for urination and defecation purposes. With little or no nourishment, the most vulnerable inhabitants in the rail cars, the children, the sick, and the elderly, quickly die from hunger, illness, and exhaustion, as well as exposure. The rail cars soon became death wagons, filled with the cries of suffering exiles and the stench of rotting corpses. In order to prevent the spread of disease, the exiles tried to remove the corpses from the rail cars whenever possible. So in some cases, Mennonites pushed their dead infant children through the ventilation openings in the cattle cars. Others threw the lifeless bodies of loved ones in nearby ditches, fields, or forests during one of the very rare stops when the guards unlocked the doors of the cattle cars for short periods of time. To find consolation during this hellish nightmare, Mennonites sang songs, they said prayers, and held informal worship and funeral services on the way to the exile camps. The secret police organized and operated the exile settlements, which became part of the Soviet Gulag penal system. So what were the purposes of these exile settlements? Well, for one, it was to reforge the kulaks. That is to remold them and to re-educate them through honest, hard forced labor into becoming good Soviet citizens. But the real, more important reason for sending these people to the exile settlements was to move millions of peasants to remote areas of the country where their forced labor would be used to colonize the north and to colonize Siberia and to develop the country's rich supply of natural resources. These were sparsely populated areas. And so we need to get people up there to develop the lumber mills, to develop the mines. And so the only way that they could do that is to use these kulaks as a way of developing these resources. But unfortunately, the government and the secret police failed to prepare adequately for the construction and operation of the exile settlements. Many exile settlements did not have proper supplies of food or accommodation, and thousands of kulaks died within weeks of their arrival at the exile settlements. It was only in late 1932 and 33, when famine conditions and epidemics were rampant in the exile settlements, that the government finally responded with more food and medical supplies. Time constraints prevent me from detailing the suffering and torture that these Mennonites experienced, and also the premature death that Mennonite exiles experienced in the Soviet Gulag. Suffice to say that most Mennonite exiles died in the Gulag. There were some survivors, but most never returned to their home villages. In many cases, Mennonite exiles formed camp families with Mennonite and non-Mennonite exiles. Some Mennonite women also became camp wives to camp guards, where they established families and became part of the communities located near the lumber camps, mines, and industrial centers in the far north in Siberia. Large number of Mennonite children in the exile camps also lost their parents. And if they did not have a family member or friend to look after them, they were often sent to the state orphanages, which became recruiting grounds for the Soviet secret police and also the military. All of these factors resulted in large numbers of Mennonites being forcibly removed from their families and communities and forced to integrate into non-Mennonite communities across the far north in Siberia. So I now want to talk briefly about collectivization. In the end, dekulakization and the deportations to the north in Siberia created a state of terror in the Soviet countryside. This understandably accelerated the transformation of Mennonite communities in Ukraine into Soviet collective farms. You know, if you don't want to be dekulakized, if you don't want to go up north to these exile settlements, you're going to join the collective farm. So most Mennonites in Ukraine joined collective farms to avoid dekulakization in exile. And by 1930, every Mennonite community in Ukraine was collectivized. In late 1930, for example, Mennonite officials in Molochansk reported that the district had 127 collectives, 1 commune, 14 dairy fermi or farm units, 17 swine fermi or farm units, several cattle associations, a state farm, 2 plemkozy or animal breeding stations, and also 2 machine tractor stations. Many of these collective farms were really run basically using horses and kind of very primitive agriculture. The Soviet government promised tractors, and they promised that there would be, these collective farms would have access to the latest equipment, mechanized equipment, farm machinery, tractors. But in reality, a lot of the machine tractor stations which housed the equipment were often inadequately supplied with tractors. Often a lot of the tractors that were provided were not operating properly. Often a lot of tractors were just simply, unusable. And so quite often, Mennonites have to rely on horses and other kind of more rudimentary farm equipment to operate their collective farms. Some Mennonite collective farms in Ukraine had only Mennonite members, but some collective farms also had Mennonites, Ukrainians, Russians, Germans, and Jews, all living together. During the first 2 years of collectivization, life on the collective farms degenerated quickly. This is because local government officials continued to increase their demands, their quotas for grain, produce, and meat from collectives on an annual basis. Some Mennonite collective farms, for example, had to deliver more than 175% of their original grain quotas on an annual basis. And by the time of the 1932-33 famine, the Holodomor, many Mennonite populated collective farms had experienced disastrous agricultural conditions. They were experiencing declining livestock herds and desperate living conditions. And despite warnings of famine in the countryside, local officials continued to increase state demands for collective farmers to deliver grain needed for their daily food rations, to deliver fodder for their animals, and to deliver the seed for future crops. In many Mennonite communities, both Mennonite and non-Mennonite officials enforced these government demands, these repressive measures, as well as internal passport regulations that prevented people from leaving their collective farms to look for food. In Molochansk, for example, the Mennonite Communist Party member I.K. Penner orchestrated some of the harshest grain procurement measures when he served as a district Soviet chairman in 1932. Officials now expelled lazy, thieving, counter-revolutionary collective farm members, some of whom were handed over to the secret police or to the People's Court for prosecution and imprisonment. Collectively, these measures had disastrous consequences for Mennonites in Ukraine. By 1932, for example, the food rations for many Mennonites ranged from 200 to 250 grams of bread per day. The dwindling supply of bread and meat also forced thousands of Mennonites to eat whatever they could. Dogs, cats, mice, crows were often in high demand. Rotting vegetables, corn stalks, thistles, tree bark, sawdust, and crushed bones also became food supplies and food staples for many. To what extent Mennonites resorted to cannibalism to stay alive is unclear. I found the account of a Johann Sawatzki from Kortica who reportedly ate his 3-year-old daughter to survive. In such dire conditions, starvation, suicide, and disease, such as typhus, smallpox, pneumonia, diphtheria, and malaria, cut short the lives of many Mennonites. During the famine, Mennonites did whatever they could to obtain food and money. For some time, Mennonites wrote hunger letters or hungerbriefe to relatives in the West, to Mennonite churches and Mennonite relief organizations, and also non-Mennonite aid agencies in Europe. And there are many different types of these hunger letters, but the two most common were the following. There were these personal letters that were really desperate pleas for food and foreign currency. In some of these letters, there are also acknowledgement of gratitude for currency and aid that they had received. Sometimes they even include references to receiving flour, sugar, salted pork, pasta, and powdered milk, and occasionally even coffee. Many of these personal letters are infused with religious images and apocalyptic themes. Many reflect a trust in God, but they also hope that Christ's return is imminent. And in many cases, these personal letters are the last wills and testaments of Mennonites on the verge of death. So here are some samples of these letters. The left one is actually quite legible, readable. And this is a person discussing her tragedy and the challenges they're facing. On the right is another typical type of letter that you find, often written on sometimes very poor paper, and often written in Goethische Schrift, which can be a challenge to read sometimes. The second most common type of letter is known as Bittebriefe or petitions. And this is a sample of one. It's often a short petition, usually on one page, often on a postcard, a Soviet postcard. So you have the address and the postcard information on one side, and on the other side is the petition for food or money. So some of these personal letters were published in Mennonite newspapers, such as Der Bote, Die Mennonische Rundschau, Ziensbote in Canada, United States. And you see a lot of these letters, at least up until May and June of 1933, a few months after Hitler comes to power in Germany. And later on, there are some letters, but they're very few and far between. And in these hunger letters, these Mennonite hunger letters, you should know that there's no mention of Hitler or Nazism. There's no mention of Nazi aid agencies or contacts with German consulates. In the West, Mennonite relatives and friends, churches, relief organizations, and government bodies, including Nazi agencies after 1933, send food and money to Soviet Germans and Mennonites in Ukraine. According to one Soviet secret report, international relief organizations transferred aid equivalent to more than 487,000 rubles of gold to Soviet Germans in Ukraine between April of 1933 and April of 1934. Another Soviet report stated more than 40,000 parcels were sent to pro-Nazi households in Molochansk between April of 1933 and August of 1934. Soviet Mennonites used these foreign funds to acquire food, often on the black market, or also in state-operated Torxen stores. These are stores that allow people to use their foreign currency, their precious metals, and their jewelry to purchase food at inflated prices. By 1933, there were almost 250 Torxen stores in Ukraine, with Mennonites often visiting shops in Tokmak, Zaporizhia, Dnepropetrovsk, Melitopol, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Mariupol, and Berdyansk. So how did Soviet officials respond to anyone who received foreign aid? According to Soviet leaders, most foreign aid was Hitler aid, that is, a Nazi attempt to embarrass and undermine the Soviet authority. Nazi officials often declared that Hitler aid was a Nazi scheme to recruit Nazi supporters and agents in Ukraine. And by mid-1933, Soviet authorities are trying to do whatever they can to prevent contact between Soviet Germans, including Mennonites, and the West. There is a Soviet postal surveillance system that often confiscates foreign food packages and packages containing money. It also imposes costly fines on anyone who received correspondence from the West. Local Soviet officials are also recruiting reliable Mennonite state employees and party members to screen the mail in Mennonite populated areas, to confiscate any foreign aid or currency in the mail, and to provide authorities with the names of Mennonites who had connections with the West. Soviet authorities now accuse those who receive foreign aid of being Hitlerites, Nazi agents, fascists, or counter-revolutionaries. And collective farm members are now required to regularly disclose any foreign aid, currency, or correspondence they had received. Soviet officials are now often searching collective farm households suspected of receiving foreign assistance. They're ordering Mennonites to send back to Germany all foreign aid to feed oppressed and starving workers in Germany. They're prohibiting collective farm members from attending Torxen stores to purchase food, and they're expelling and arresting collective farm members who receive money or goods from outside the USSR. For many Mennonite collective farm members, these allegations that they were Hitlerists, fascists, and Nazi agents came as a complete surprise. Few knew who Hitler and the Nazis were or understood what they represented. I should also mention that there was a purge in 1933 to 1935, and that purge began in April. When famine was raging in the Ukrainian countryside, the Soviet leadership decided to initiate a nationwide purge of Communist Party and eventually local government bodies. And the purpose of the purge was to identify and expel Kulak elements and other enemies of the state who had infiltrated the Communist Party and state institutions. In the spring of 1934, for example, Molochansk officials alleged that Kulaks, Hitlerists, Nazi agents, and fascists constituted at least 40% of the local collective farm population, and that at least 90% of the inhabitants in some communities. In the spring of 1934, for example, Molochansk authorities claimed that at least 23 collective farm chairmen, mostly Mennonites, were fascists and class aliens. And in July and August, that 1 month period in 1934, Molochansk officials purged at least 115 fascists, many of whom were Mennonites who worked in local government organizations, hospitals, and educational institutions. These Mennonites were purged for a host of crimes, such as having family members who were Nazi agents, who were hosting Hitlerist meetings, who were recruiting Nazi supporters, who were receiving aid from abroad, who were circulating German addresses or cultivating connections with Nazi Germany, who were acquiring Hitlerist food through a Torxen store, who were working as a preacher or religious cult leader who distracted collective farm members from the work, or who were working as a teacher who attempted to convert children to fascism. The Soviet secret police also took measures to liberate Mennonite communities from anti-Soviet elements associated with fascism. Mennonites were now imprisoned, sometimes for 6 to 8 year terms, for offenses such as possessing the address of a German relief organization. The secret police also exiled, and in some cases executed, Mennonite leaders for their alleged involvement in fascist organizations. Some final observations. Dekulakization and collectivization had profound consequences for Mennonite communities in Ukraine. These Stalinist policies helped to remove, through imprisonment and exile, many economic, religious, and political leaders in Mennonite communities. Also helped to transfer Mennonite property and wealth to the Soviet state. It helped to erode ethnic identity of Mennonites. It helped to dissolve the cohesiveness of Mennonite communities, and also to facilitate the integration of Mennonite communities into the state's collective farm system and the larger Soviet peasantry. Rapid collectivization also led to agricultural and economic catastrophe in the Ukrainian countryside. By 1932-33, famine conditions, the Holodomor, arose in many regions of Ukraine, leading to the premature death of almost 4 million people in Ukraine. In these desperate conditions, Mennonites sought aid and money from the West. Some of the aid came from Nazi Germany, and soon Soviet leaders accused anyone of receiving aid from the West of being Hitlerists, Nazi agents, and fascists. This ultimately resulted in the Soviet government's repressive attack on Soviet Germans and Soviet Mennonites as enemy nations in 1933 to 1936. And that included anti-Soviet German campaigns, purges, arrests, imprisonments, deportations, and executions. For Mennonites in Ukraine, the Soviet regime's anti-German repression of 1933 to 1936 was an extension of the terror and suffering that they experienced during collectivization, dekulakization, and the Famine Holodomor. It also served as a painful prelude to the vicious Great Terror of 1936 to 1938 that led to the imprisonment or exile of more than 1 million Soviet citizens, as well as the intentional killing of hundreds of thousands of individuals. During this decade of continuous uninterrupted repression, many Mennonites in Ukraine had no breathing space from terror, suffering, and death. Today, Ukrainians are in a violent struggle to defend their country from Russian invaders. Given the fact that large numbers of Mennonites were incorporated into Ukrainian Russian communities already before World War I, and certainly during the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s and thereafter, there's a high probability that some of the Ukrainian soldiers and refugees that we see on TV, as well as the Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine, have some Mennonite connection in their family background. And this certainly brings the horrible war closer to home for those of us who claim Russian Mennonite and Ukrainian Mennonite heritage. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation. Very enlightening, and I think we'll give a second for the Q&A to fill up, and I see there's already some questions in there that have popped up while you've been sharing all this with us. So I'll open it up right now, and maybe we can return to some different elements of the talk. One of the questions that comes up, and I think this is also discussed in the edited collection, European Mennonites and the Holocaust, is about the identity of Mennonites as far as you're able to determine it through the sources when you're talking about the 1920s, in this case context, the 1930s. Are you looking at Mennonite church membership, Mennonite names, or other factors when kind of searching for these records in archives?
Yeah, so I mean, Mennonite names is one way of doing it, but that's really kind of the first start. I mean, I often look at the Mennonite communities themselves, right? I'm looking at Khortytsa, Molochansk, and so I'm looking at villages where Mennonites have lived since the time of Catherine the Great or Paul, right? And so you see these Mennonites, typically they're the lowest, classes of Mennonite society that are participating in various levels of government. And so, I mean, I see lots of Neufeldts, for example, participating in this. I didn't show any of those names, Neufeldt names, in the list that I had, but when you look at so many of these villages, you see that Mennonites, they are part of these Mennonite communities, and even though they don't always identify with the Mennonite church, in some cases they were baptized Mennonite, but they don't really belong to the Mennonite church per se, but they still identify as Mennonites, especially during World War I, when they're looking for exemption from military service, right? They'll often use their baptism records as a way of demonstrating that they are Mennonite. But in reality, their connection to the Mennonite church is really kind of tenuous at best. It's through baptism. And so many of them, they identify as themselves as Mennonite from an ethnic point of view, but in terms of their commitment to Mennonite religious practices and that's a different story.
Thank you for that response. That does tie into a second kind of related question from Peter Rempel, who sort of asks, thinking about the Mennonites that are denouncing fellow Mennonites from their community, how could they claim to be Mennonite? And do you think when Mennonites joined some of these organizations within the hierarchy of the Communist Party or took part in these things like dekulakization, was this seen then as an ultimate severing of themselves from their community in terms of identification? You kind of refer to them as being sort of peripheral already, or is that kind of what led them further out to begin with?
So I mean, dekulakization and collectivization happens in the late 1920s and early 1930s. But there are a lot of Mennonites that are participating in this, in the mid 1920s, when you don't have dekulakization, when you don't have collectivization. So they are part of the system. And like I said, a lot of Mennonites are working for the government, but they're not Communist Party members. But they're working for the system. And then, things ramp up. Oh, well, now we have to start, identifying these kulaks. And so there's this increasing, it's kind of like the lobster in the pot, right? The pot gets hotter and hotter. The lobster doesn't realize where this is always going. And it's the same thing for a lot of these Mennonites until they realize, oh, now we have to go to this next level. Before I was just helping with, organizing, maybe collective farms, or is helping with this, but now there's this greater expectation on me to start identifying kulaks, right? And if I don't identify so many families in my village or my community, then I'm going to be identified, right? And so, it's either you or it's me. And not all of these Mennonites are Communist Party members. They're just people that are working, at various levels in the government, but they have these expectations, these orders. And if you don't carry them out, it's you and your family that's going to be dekulakized, right? So if you're a local village Soviet official and you don't carry out the orders, well, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you demonstrating your loyalty to the regime? And so a lot of people do that because they fear that if they don't, they're going to be on the train, the next train for exile. And so, it's a matter of, just making this decision. It's either you or it's me. And as dekulakization and collectivization proceeds, eventually even some of the poorest members of the community are identified as kulaks, not because they have any more land or they have any more horses than anyone else, but sometimes it's revenge. Sometimes people in government positions, they don't like somebody. They don't like that neighbor of mine who created so many problems. You know what? We're going to go after him. And even though he doesn't really fit into the category of kulak, the term kulak becomes very slippery and expansive over time. And so eventually you have sometimes even the poorest members of the community now being identified as kulaks. That happens in late 1930, 1931, where people thought there's no way I would ever be identified as kulak. But now we have another quota of kulaks, and now suddenly my name is on there. Why is my name on there? Well, it must be revenge by somebody who doesn't want, they want to avoid being dekulakized, so they're naming me.
Okay. That seems to touch on another question we have here about, did the dekulakization quotas require a certain number of each of the 3 tiers of kulaks you identify, that there was an expectation that a certain number of people would be brought forward from each community?
So often when you read, there's this order that you're supposed to, from Queering, Willems, and Dick, you're supposed to identify kulak families, but they don't say that you have to have so many counter-revolutionary kulak active. You're just supposed to identify them, right? And so these villages, they come together and they put together these lists and they describe, well, this is how much land this person had, now, this is how much they had before the revolution. This is how many horses they have now. This is what they had prior to the revolution. Oh, this person hires, peasants to work for them on a daily basis. Or this person had a threshing machine, right? And so then it's really up to the district Soviet to make that final call to say, oh, you know what? This person here really fits within the counter-revolutionary kulak active. And we're going to recommend that this person be executed or exiled right away. But in many cases, these poor villages, they're just coming up with lists. We have to come up with 10 families in our village. So let's come up with this list and let's get it sent off and leave it up to the district Soviet officials to make that final decision as who's going to be the category 3, who's going to be category 2, who's going to be category 1 kulaks, and what's going to happen to them.
Okay, and we're coming just right up to the end of our time, so unfortunately we can't run too much longer, but I did have another question here because you just mentioned the trio of Queering, Wilms, and Dick. Are you able to follow the sources through and see, what the fate of some of these individuals were as we move through the 1930s and sort of the campaigns of terror expand? Are they then pulled in, or are they, anyways, that was the...
Right, so when you look at what goes on in the terror in the late 1930s, you see, this kind of, it's identifying people who are enemies of the state, right? And the terror in many respects is focusing, not always, but focusing on officials. So people who did the so-called dirty work in the early 1930s, they're often identified as threats to the regime in the late 1930s. Not all of them, but there's so many names that you find out, oh, well, this person was working at this level in the early 1930s, but now they're being identified as a threat to the regime and being, either exiled or imprisoned. So people who often, were part of the system in the early 1930s, quite often, not always, but quite often they're identified as enemies of the state in the late 1930s as part of the terror. And so ironically, they're the ones that are also eventually shipped off either to prisons or to exile settlements.
Colin, I want to thank you so much and recognize that I hadn't had a chance to get to all of the questions that have been posted in the Q&A and in the chat here, but a very important discussion of a very horrific time for Mennonites that were not able to leave and make it to Canada in the earlier part of the 1920s. And I'll just remind us on that note as we wrap up here that the other videos from our previous presentations are available on the CTMS website. And of course, these presentations are all geared towards 2023, right? As we look towards a three-part Russlander Centenary train tour, which will also be having a conference in Winnipeg to correspond to the arrival of the train in July of 2023. And hopefully Colin and others who are experts in this history will be able to join us there as well. So thank you so much, and I'll bid all of you a good night.